I'm Edie Lush, and I'm here in Davos at the Hub Culture Pavilion. Very pleased to be joined by Mike Oreskes, Senior Managing Editor at AP. Thanks for stopping by.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Tell me, what's on your mind here in Davos?
Well, Edie, I've been thinking a lot about the flow of information, and particularly the free flow of independent information. Everywhere as you look now, from the issue of eradicating poverty to the issue of controlling the internet, you see that the free flow of independent information is really vital, and it's something we take for granted. Those of us who were fortunate to grow up in the Western world where we just take freedom of speech, freedom of the press for granted, we just assume that information will flow freely. But in fact, there are all sorts of pressures on it. Pressures from government, pressures from corporations to control the flow of information and to shape the story in the way they would like to see it shaped. And more I see that journalists, advocacy groups, NGOs are in a struggle to actually simply preserve the flow of information. And it's very, very important.
So where do you see it being a problem? Because you've talked about we take it for granted in the West. Constitutional right, it feels like.
Right.
But what about in the States? Is there an issue there?
Well, I'll give you two examples, one from the States and one out in the world, in the rest of the world. In the States, we find that from the Obama White House to state governments all across the country, there is an increasing desire to keep control of access to information about the work of the government. In other words, the work that the government is doing for the public, there is greater and greater effort to control it and to keep journalists and others from having equal and free access to it. And that's a very worrisome trend. But you see that here, if that's happening in what are supposedly the freest parts of the world, imagine what goes on in places that don't have the same traditions of freedom. And this is really crucial because all the evidence from studies all over the world is that there is a direct relationship between the free flow of information, the fight against corruption, and economic growth. They actually are related to each other. So if you can guarantee free flow of information, you reduce corruption, you improve economic growth and the spread of wealth in countries all over the world. So if the leading countries in the Western world are not setting a good example for the free flow of information, it will actually impede the ability to eradicate poverty, to create greater equality in the rest of the world.
So where does technology sit in this?
Well, technology is, of course, a two-edged sword.
Right.
It's obviously a huge enabler of information when you're able to do it. But I think people have come to view it as simply a guarantee of free information, and it is not that, because first of all, the technology itself is controlled by the people who have the key to the technology, and the information you put into it is only as good as the independence and freedom of the people who put it in.
Right. And do you feel pressures from technology, from government? How does it work from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective as a journalist, and for the many journalists I work with, we're feeling pressures all the time from countries all over the world.
Like where?
Well, we've had these issues in Japan, we've had these issues in war-torn countries. As I mentioned, we've had these issues in the United States of America, where our journalists are constantly finding that they need to assert the right to have access to events, to information, to things that you might think would be routine. And in fact, we find we have to do a lot of fighting and pushing simply to be allowed in to see events that the public has a right to see and that we have a right only as the stand-in for the public, really.
Mike, thanks so much for stopping by.
It's really a pleasure.
Hub Culture Pavilion here in Davos, and I'm Edie Lush.